Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Parenting is Easy, Said No One Ever. I am your host, Chananya Abraham, and I am so excited to share with you an awesome conversation that I had with Dr. Jenny Wu, who specifically works in the area of emotional intelligence and how that's something that can really enhance personally as a parent, maybe even professionally as well. She's someone that has a background working in Marriott, executive functioning, executive leadership skills. She's spoken at Google. She's written and made an awesome game that she's going to talk a little bit about that we're going to post in our links that you can purchase. As always, please reach out with any questions, concerns, comments. If you have ideas for guests, you can reach out to us at parentingiseasypodcast@gmail.com. Stay tuned for this awesome episode. I look forward to hearing your response. So I want to get right into I think an area when it comes to emotional intelligence, and obviously would love to hear your explanation of what that means and how it's something we can get more of. But I think specifically regarding parental vulnerability when it comes to understanding emotional intelligence and how we're able to work at it ourselves and also implement it when it comes to parenting. So the floor is yours, and I'd love to hear what you have to say on this.
Yeah, I love these questions. Where to start? Well, we often focus on how to make our kids better, how to give them the skills, how to have these teachable moments. But what we don't realize in the realm of emotional intelligence is that we, as parents, caregivers, we have a lot to learn ourselves. And the tricky thing with emotional intelligence, when it comes to emotions, it varies by context, by situation, and by who you're talking to. And so we think we've got it. We're supposed to be the adults doing the adulting parenting thing. But this is tremendously new, uncharted territories for us. And as our kids, embark on different milestones, their emotional needs change and broaden, right? And we also need to adapt ourselves. So that parenting vulnerability is really about learning with our kids, whatever age they might be, milestones, learning together, and honestly making mistakes along the way.
Mm,
And I love that you say, you kind of alluded to the fact that these are sets of skills that can be learned, and I can tell you so many myths that, if I have to had to, like, clarify with people what emotional intelligence really is, we can certainly get into that.
yeah, I would love to, and I think the concept of a child being able to see that, hey, mommy, daddy are working on something, and we have a lot to grow in this area. I think is such an important and valuable skill for our kids to be able to learn. How would you go about talking to parents that, okay, you work on A, B, and C, or these are things that you can grow in when it comes to your emotional intelligence, but at the same time, also have your kids work on certain things and let them see what it is that you're working on.
Yeah, I think it starts with the mindset, right? As parents, we're not perfect people, and we're not trying to model what perfection looks like. That is absolutely impossible. If anything, it's really modeling, how do you deal with emotional discomfort, with uncomfortable situations, right? The cringy moments that we have. How do you recover from that? How do you manage and cope these emotions? And how do you repair relationships, especially with our kids, right? During those inevitable moments when we're yelling at our kids for yelling themselves, right?
Oh my God,
How many
yeah.
times do we do the double take or sort of in the back of our heads going, "Wait a minute, I'm doing exactly what I'm telling my kid not to do," right? It's really those moments that I tell parents to take notice. It's not the time to feel ashamed or feel like, "Oops, I made a blunder again," or "What's wrong with me?" or "I'm not a good enough parent," but rather use those moments to model to our kids, how do you fix it? How do you grow together? How do you get better? Right. And so that mindset shift and that, you know, not being perfect, learning from our mistakes, learning together is the biggest thing that I emphasize with parents.
Yeah, and I think that that's really important regarding that word together, and that you and I, me and my child, we're trying to learn and grow. And sometimes it's not just about I'm teaching you something, but we're learning together. And I think that could be really helpful when it comes to us trying to strive to be the best parents we can. Like you said, there's no such thing as perfect parenting, and I think it's something that we're learning and constantly growing with. And we have different ages that we're dealing with within a child. And then you can also have situations like you have as well where you have multiple children, and you have to be able to have that healthy balance of dealing with that preteen and the teenager at the same time. So how do you go about making sure that we're doing it properly? I mean, how I would have a conversation with my 16-year-old is going to be very different the way I'm going to have a conversation with my 9-year-old. And having that sense of, yeah, we're both learning and growing together, and this is something that we're doing together, not necessarily I'm teaching you, but what's that balance, and how do we make sure that that emotional intelligence can grow in all those scenarios simultaneously?
Yeah, absolutely. So the balance that you're referring to, I would say it's that power dynamic balance. And, just to give you some concrete personal examples, right? I've got three children right now. I have a teenager and I have twins who are teenagers. So, almost 12-year-old twins with a 14-year-old, right? So, how I approach, learning together, growing together, and sort of teaching them these emotional intelligence skills is very different when they were toddlers, kids, twins to now how I correspond or sort of dynamically work with my teens, and it's the power, right? As kids get older, they are drawn to independence, right? Autonomy, and it's about being cognizant of sharing the power with our kids in age appropriate ways so that they feel like they are valued, they're respected, and they have sort of room to grow, but grow on their own at their own pace and independently, right? So it's kind of, when if you're a parent of younger kids, they want to please you. They love you so much and they listen to you despite the tantrums you might get, right? They want to you to share with the joy and the sorrows that they're experiencing. So you may have, some power, right, to some say. But as they get older, you'll notice as a parent, and that's what I'm going through right now, is that it's sort of learning on their own terms, your teens and twins. And so that's where it's about doing more listening than talking. It truly is. And in some ways is doing less is more, is better. And so this is where sort of that power dynamic you're shifting, right? It's not about doing the right thing, the proper thing, right, at the right time, but it's really helping our kids to understand what's right and wrong and being able to c call upon that at their own time when it's needed, right? And that's about building responsible decision making. So, I know right now it's very sort of abstract what we're talking about, right? So, let's think of an example, right? And so, I think one of the biggest problem I see in parenting these days is that parents want to take away the obstacles, whether it's sort of emotional discomfort or maybe, having a fight with a friend, parents always want to fix it, right? Because for us, it feels bad when our kids feel bad and we get into this problem solving mode of doing something. But I think from an emotional intelligence perspective, it's not just about understanding how to feel happy, how to get happy, right? Because that's impossible. We want our kids to understand when they're struggling, when they're sort of suffering in their own context, how they can cope with these situations.
Right.
So, in those cases, if your kid is having a fight, sometimes you might just have to bite your tongue and not do anything and allow the kids to work it out. So, be the consultant, be the guide instead of being the problem solver yourself. You can offer encouragements, right? Words of encouragement, validating their feelings, right? It may not be a big deal to you as a parent, but it is a big deal in their own eyes because they've only, been alive on this earth for however short amount of time compared to you, right? They have less brought in experience or wisdom, really, in that
Right.
sense. So, recognizing emotion, validating it, providing words of encouragement, offering suggestions. That might be social scripts, suggested, scenarios what you could do. You can role play, but it's not about solving the problem for them.
Right, right, and I think there's like a lot to be said, specifically, let's say, of not doing certain things, and I think in parenting, that's for sure something that I've had to learn on the job of realizing my role right now is not to do anything, and that's just as important as doing. And I think there is a fine line of, let's say, if there's teasing going on as opposed to bullying, and when a parent should be getting involved and not getting involved. And I think you bring up some good points of our job is to be able to help them build up themselves and have that autonomy, feel like a individual, have that the independence that we want them to have. As much as we want them to be close by, we also want them to have a life and to be the best version of themselves. So figuring that out, I think, is something that takes time. And as a parent, we're constantly adjusting. And for every child, whether, and I'm sure it applies to your twins as well, you're going to treat each one differently as well because they each need different things. And knowing when to intervene is going to be different for every child. And I think that's something that we're constantly learning to grow with and grow on. You mentioned something as well when you talk about the concept of their happiness. And I've heard this something a while ago and something I'm still trying to process. And I've talked it over with my wife. I've talked it in my therapy room as well. The concept of a parent's job is not necessarily to make our kids happy. It's their job to make them happy. It's our job to help them find the road to their happiness. And I'm curious when it comes to emotional intelligence and specifically that skill of what that we're talking about here. What is the role of the parent when it comes to having the right recipe for emotional intelligence, both for themselves and for their child, and helping them find their road to happiness, but not helping with their happiness?
Yeah, I love that. So, emotional intelligence is really about being smart with your emotions and understanding, all emotions are for a purpose. Wanna, going with sort of happiness, right? We identify that with a good emotion. And sometimes, unfortunately, we identify the unpleasant emotions with bad emotions. And as parents, we need to get rid of the bad emotions, right? And that is completely untrue. Each emotion, especially the bad ones, the unpleasant ones, are data. They're here for a purpose to tell us what we need, what we find to be important, what we care about, right? And what's important, our values in life. And so to get rid of the bad emotions, right, is essentially getting rid of almost the compass of our kid's life and understanding, well, I'm feeling uncomfortable in this pure situation. I am feeling pressured, right? I need to rather remove myself or speak up or say something, right? If you remove those emotions, they're they're signals, right? They are missing the signal and telling and understanding why they're feeling this way. So, in terms of emotional intelligence, it's really being able to recognize all emotions, precisely and accurately label those emotions, not just mad and sad, but at a much granular level. Because, it's like when we get sick, right? We find the symptoms that are pointing us to what we need to do to feel better, to address the sickness, right? To really understand the root cause instead of slapping on a band aid. And so, with emotional intelligence, if you are numbing down the bad emotions, you're slapping on the Band-Aid without realizing, why is it, right? Your child is feeling uncomfortable, and why is it you're feeling uncomfortable? And so, and the tricky thing is, it's also accepting and understanding that we can have conflicting emotions at the same time. Right. I use this example a lot where, for us as parents, we feel stressed a whole lot of times, similar to our kids, because we look around and see other parents doing something better than ourselves. It could be our friends, right? At one point, we feel happy for our friends, we admire them, but perhaps on the other end, we are holding emotions of, feeling envious of something, right? And on top of that, we are feeling bad about ourselves, the fact that we are having these emotions about our friends or family members. And so those are a mixture of emotions we're holding at the same time, the good, the bad, the ugly, and they are conflicting, right? So, as parents, being emotionally intelligent is understanding and deciphering these emotions, right? And being able to hold on to them at the same time, knowing that at the same time that emotions are temporary. They're states, not traits. They will go away. And so having those coping mechanisms in managing that emotions, both for ourselves and supporting our kids and managing these emotional discomfort and having the agility to adapt.
Yeah, very, very well said, and I appreciate a lot of things you're saying, and at least in my practice, when I talk about you're allowed to have, we give ourselves permission, which sometimes can be hard, having multiple emotions on the couch at the same time, which happens all the time. We can feel multiple things at once, and I think just the awareness of that, I think, is really, really important, and giving ourselves permission, and obviously teaching it to our kids, giving them permission to feel multiple things at once, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And I couldn't stop thinking as you're talking now, of obviously something that a lot of therapists talk about in their office: mindfulness and having a sense of awareness. And I'm curious to hear from you as you talk about building skills, which I would love to get more into, and specifically the games and stuff. But when we talk about mindfulness, what comes to mind for you, and how does that something that comes into play when you're talking to people regarding emotional intelligence?
Yeah. So what comes to mind right now is sort of what I mentioned, acceptance. Being mindful is accepting what you're feeling because on the 2 end of the spectrum, right, you're suppressing it, right? You may temporarily be aware, be mindful of what you're feeling and you realize, "Oh, that's a bad feeling. I need to distract myself. I need to numb myself." Right? I need to do something else to forget about it, right? So that's on one end. And on the other end is ruminating it, perhaps over mindfulness. And the interventions I create, I call it mindfulness, right? Because you're holding on to these emotions for too long. You're repeating the scenario over and over and over in your mind. So that's holding your mind too full. You're cognitively overloaded emotionally as well. And so striking that balance of mindfulness, of being aware of it, understanding, deciphering what it means to you, accepting it, acknowledging it, right? Validating this emotion to yourself. Again, like you said, giving yourself the permission to feel, right? To really feel it. But then being able to regulate, right? To take action, to do something about it adaptively is what comes to mind for me for mindfulness for emotional intelligence.
Yeah, and I think it's so important for us to be able to acknowledge it, and probably essential in order to go ahead and work on being able to process it properly. And when we have that state of mind, then, oh, okay, now I know what to do. The way I talk about it in the office is, ever walk into a room, we forget why you're there. And when you take a second just to pause and, oh yeah, okay, I came in here to get my charger. And it's like, okay, so now that I'm aware of it, I know what I need to find. And I think emotions work the same way. We're like, okay, what's happening right now? Why is it that I feel like I need to raise my voice to my child, even though they really did nothing? Oh, it's me. It's not them. So now I sort of put myself in that place of doing that. Now that's a skill we have to work on, because I think we could all use this, whether what you want to call it patience, you want to call it awareness, and then so many different ways of referring to it. How is that something, or how would you work with parents when it comes to working on their skills then they need to work on, and then also trying to get them to work with their kids, whether it's simultaneously or maybe in a separate way, to
Mm.
build up that skill when it comes to having that awareness. How would you talk to them?
Absolutely. So being able to exercise the skill, what I say is go for the low hanging fruit and make it easy for yourself. A lot of the times, parents tend to think, in the heat of the moment, I need to practice these skills and exercise them. But do you realize that is so hard, right? I mean, when's the last time you can talk your child out of a tantrum and talk yourself out of a
Mhm.
screaming match? right?
Yeah.
So one thing I do a lot with the parents is being proactive. Really plan out what you might do in the heat of moment way ahead of times before sort of like this externalizing like hot moments, right? When we can't think, our, amygdala hijack is taking over. So first of all, the first step is understanding your triggers, right?
Mm.
What causes you to get overly stressed, right? Overwhelmed, irritated. And, you mentioned sometimes, when you're screaming, you realize, oh, it's not you, it's not my kid, it's me, right? It might be because you were already triggered way before you had a conversation with your child. Maybe you had a bad day at work. Maybe there's a pet peeve that your significant other or someone did that really just rubs you off the wrong way. And so you sort of already been, carrying this sort of irritation around and growing these hot buttons around your body so that if anybody says anything, and most likely your child, your hot button is being pressed and boom, the volcano erupts. So being proactive, we map out, here are my pet peeves. Here are the tendencies I have when I'm triggered, right? How do I show up when I'm stressed? And how does my body feel when I'm feeling stressed? So parents do that first, and then they can do that proactively with their children, right? When my fist, is clenching, my jaws are clenching, I am frowning, right? And my heart rate, that's a sign. Those are symptoms, right? Those are signs hinting that, hey, a screaming match might be coming. What can you do to take a pause, right? Take a deep breath. So it's really planning ahead, right? Before the actual scenario.
Okay, so I want you to play it out with me. I mean, I have so many questions on that, but I'll be honest. The first thing that's coming to mind is let's call it an actual live example that let's say my wife and I are going through right now. Let's say my daughter just got her license, and she's I could take the car to go out. I'm like, okay, fine, no problem. You want to go out? You want to be back in 10 minutes? No problem. Come out. Go to your friend's house. I mean, she can't take anyone with her. At least here in Connecticut, you still have about 6 months before you can take anyone else in the car. And now it's become like almost a ritual thing of can I take the car? Like, no, but you're not going anywhere. I know, but right now there's no reason for you to be going out. And then there's that constant like, yeah, but why? Well, because mommy and daddy don't want you to go out right now, and there's no reason to. And just because you have a license doesn't mean you should. And the way we talk about it in the house is, I guess, to say along the lines of just because you can doesn't mean you should. We talk about it regarding finances, regarding our freedoms, regarding our food, and I think it's a way that my wife and I would talk about other things. And I think when it comes to teenager, like, yeah, but give me a reason. Like, you're home. I have no homework to do. I'm not doing anything right now, and it's still light outside. So, like, why not? Like, well, because we said so. And yeah, but that's not a reason. You hate when I say that to you. I'm like, oh, you're right. That's true. But I'm also your parent. So, and then there's that higher level that comes into play regarding voices and regarding words and regarding the intensity of the conversation. So, not that I'm playing out the whole thing for you, but just giving that as an example of something. Where can a parent, or I guess in this situation myself, what can be worked on regarding the emotional intelligence that I need to work on to help this situation not escalate and turn into, you know what, just let's just stop this conversation before we both blow up type thing.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my goodness, such a real thing, right? Um, and so okay, so this reminds me of getting a phone, right? Its
Ah,
inheritance is a bit of a huge privilege, right? Being able
right.
to drive a car. So with responsibility comes power, but also comes responsibility and boundaries. And so setting the boundaries of when you can exercise these responsibilities. So when I say being proactive is, for example, even creating a contract or creating parameters of when you can take the car out, under which circumstances, right? Being as concrete, as black and white as you can, so that there is some leeway for negotiation and influence. And, teens are great and that they can push the boundaries, they can sort of use their words, their reasoning, now their logical reasoning and maybe some reverse psychology to convince you, and it's a great trait, right? But knowing that and knowing that they may be doing that in your most vulnerable or a stressed moment, you want to set these parameters ahead of time. So when, for example, when I first gave my son the phone, I really set, these parameters in a contract that we've laid out. And so then when they're asking or they're violating certain situations and your car situation, right, you can point to sort of almost these rules and contracts that we've agreed upon, so that there's less argument. There's less going in circles, right? Or going to you, if not going to the mom or, whoever who can call the shots so that everybody is on the same page because that is the the hardest part, right? Staying on the same page, getting onto the same page. And, it's not gonna be perfect, right? But if there's something you can point to, um, to make the argument or the debate a little bit easier and more concrete, the better of the mental load that we're
I love
carrying.
that. I love that. And I think the biggest thing I'm taking away from here is that the parents need to have communication behind the scenes, and there has to be prep when it comes to having certain conversations. Now, it's not just about the car, it's not just about the phone, but in general, when we talk about emotional intelligence, a lot of it has to do with prep. And it's not just about, okay, what do I do in this situation? Let me pull out my cheat sheet, right? It's being able to have those situations already. Oh yeah, we talked about this before, and my wife and I talked about it before, and so we know how to go about this. If you have a certain child that you know is going to throw tantrums and they might be already 10, 11 years old, okay, so what do we do in those situations with this child? Or the other one is going to be like, well, I need more than an answer than because, or because I said so. Okay, so let's figure it out beforehand. And that collaboration and that unity that the home front slash parents are going to put into place, I think is key. I think that's like the biggest thing that I'm taking from what you're saying on the topic of phones. And I think this is something that I know I have a lot of questions about specifically, but what role does technology itself play in emotional intelligence, and how has that changed, let's say today, than as little as 5 years ago when it comes to emotional intelligence?
Yeah, technologies are tools, right? We can use these tools whether productively or in the case of, in my opinion, social media and how many parents, right, and their kids use the phone today. It's very much unproductive and it's almost like who's using whom, right? We are being driven by technology, by phone, by social media instead of the other way around. So to answer your question, compared to 5 years ago, even 10 years ago, right? um, the role of technology has really shifted and changed, especially with AI. Um, what is human anymore, right? And what is our role, and how do you stay human, and what is our true value add? So, in any case, I do a lot of speaking in the corporate world and businesses as a social entrepreneur and a business coach. I really talk about the humanness in workplace and in leadership because that is what we're left with nowadays when we have, AI, Chat GPT to regurgitate any information, right, that we need. And so it's really about building relationships, social skills. And those are components, the interpersonal components of emotional intelligence.
Is it
Um,
easier or harder today because of what we have available to us?
Yeah, both. It takes a village. I know that's an unfair question, but it's the ecosystem. It certainly takes a village. And, communication is easier than ever, right? We have all means and forms of communicating, but that's very much at the surface level, which makes it harder, right? We take that for granted, but yet having that deeper, vulnerable human connection is becoming harder because we are so used to, thanks to technology, social media, of these little bits and pieces of one-off, tweets and conversations and chats, but we're hiding behind that, right? We are very much hiding behind our phone, behind social media, and to really having that vulnerable, deep conversation of exactly truly how we think without feeling being judged, right? Having that social exchange is so hard and that face to face, right? Which is a key component of how we get our social cues, our body language, nonverbals, our signaling. So that's very much becoming harder today, right? We are working remotely more so. So that's why I say both. And, there are research showing that we are going through an emotional recession. We are having a harder time of really reading, right, these emotional expressions, these micro expressions. And in fact, there's research, for example, out of UCLA that found that when we take kids into sort of like a very nature based camp without technology, after a few weeks, they actually gain more of the skills of being able to read each other's facial expressions. So again, these are skills that can be learned, but the barrier to learning these skills, the number of opportunities that we have, are made harder today.
Oh, for sure. And I think it's really, really hard, and I think it's like most things, especially when it comes to parenting, having the proper balance. Have you seen certain pieces of technology or apps or other types of devices that could be beneficial to the learning and the growth in emotional intelligence?
There are apps around things like Mood Meter where it helps you bring up your mindfulness, becoming more mindful of how you're
Mm.
feeling, what you're experiencing in the moment, and you can log that and maybe see some trends. It's almost like in research, we have the daily diary and the sort of the state of your emotion check. But to be honest, it really comes down to the simplest of the simple face-to-face connections and conversations. You don't really need much tools to do that. In fact, it's about minimizing, right? Digital minimalism, and minimizing what you have around you and just being present with the person in front of you, whether it's your child or friends and coworkers. So yeah, I'm not seeing any tech that really enables it or amplifies human connection other than just pure human connection.
Yeah, and I agree. At the same time, I'm also trying to be open. I guess growing up in a world where internet wasn't really a thing, and until I was an adult, so it wasn't necessarily something that I'm dependent on. I guess you could say the way my kids are, but at the same time, trying to be open and non-judgmental when it comes to technology is something that I think we have to be. If we're trying to grow as people, if we're parents, if we're in situations where we want to be able to have that sense of I'm changing for tomorrow because tomorrow is a new day. I think it's something we have to be constantly open with. And it's hard because there has to be a balance, and obviously today, as we are right now, we're using technology, and that's not something that's going to go away anytime soon. So it's about knowing how to use it properly, and I think it's just one of those things that we have to be aware of, which will I think evolve over time and change constantly. You've talked about, the growth that you've had as well, and I've heard you talk about it. And I obviously I want to get into when you talk about, cards and stuff that you've used to play and in order to enhance these skills and work with and bring about awareness. But I want to first talk about specifically when it comes to our children. Have you seen situations where what you are trying to teach and give over to others that your children have sort of taken and sort of thrown back at you, and it sort of hits you in a way where like, oh my gosh, like, okay, I'm trying to teach something, but I'm also learning something at the same time. What would be an example of something that's happened, let's say, to you specifically, and what would that lesson be that you've sort of had to change around a little bit because of your own kids?
Yeah. It's so funny. So you mentioned this earlier, right? As parents, when we have multiple children, our kids are growing at their pace and they're very different. So you have to adapt differently to different kids. And that's something that I've certainly experienced and have gotten it, sort of the same approach I used on another child of mine have gotten thrown back at me and say, hey, this doesn't work with me. You need to use something else, right? So I have a strong-willed child, so twins, actually. One is incredibly emotionally intelligent, and the other one is, whip smart, strong-willed. You really just, you cannot tame this. You won't get tamed. So those are the situations where, with my very emotionally in tuned one, I can say something, right? And she can adapt herself and understanding, seeing where I'm coming from and sort of take my suggestion and roll with it. Whereas the other one, if I say the same thing, He's like, "No, no, no, mommy. But what about this?" Then, similar to the car situation, it's like bending, metal. I get into this. Requires me to be adaptive and to understand, my agenda is not his agenda. He understands where I'm coming from, but he's not ready to change or take my suggestion at this moment. And I should be okay. And, having like um, honoring that my child would like to do something his way or a different way. It may even come out to be more efficient. And I get the "Mommy, I told you so," right? Which is
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
great. It's
For
great.
sure, for
I
sure,
I
and I think
love it.
if we're able to embrace that, it shows so much regarding the relationship and regarding like, "Oh, okay, so she's not a authoritarian figure. She's someone that is able to bend a little bit, not be metal." The way I like talking about it in my office is that we wanna try to be more like palm trees and not like pine trees, because we wanna be able to be flexible, and it's really important for us to be, and when we had those situations with our kid where, like, they can say, "See, this way works better," like, "Oh, you know what? Awesome," and I think it helps, really bond in the relationship when we're able to have those type of moments, and if we embrace it, and when we bring our own ego and sort of put it away, and we can do that way, I think that goes a really, really long way. And I think that's to your point that I've heard you talk about regarding being more preventative as opposed to being reactive, and in this conversation, and I think in general when it comes to our emotional IQ, what can us as parents try to do to be more preventative as opposed to being reactive when it comes to our emotional intelligence?
Yeah, so we talked about preparing ahead, right? But I think it's about being curious and being open. Really remind ourselves that, how we see the world is not how our children see the world. And, being curious and where is this coming from? How are they seeing the world? Because, you know, sort of admitting that we could be wrong, right? Having that humility that, again, we're growing together. We don't know everything, right? And so understanding that and being curious and wanting to not just teach our children, but to learn from our kids both about them, how they see the world, and how we may all together, you know, um, problem solve a situation. Because these are new, problems that are being thrown at all of us, and times are different, not how we grew up. So acknowledging that will allow us to stay open, right? And again, doing more listening, observing than just talking at and lecturing. I would say those are real skill sets that we
Mm.
parents can practice both at home and really anywhere.
Okay, I need some examples. How would we go about working on that?
So, when our kids are perhaps throwing a tantrum or having had a bad day, right? They tend to first unload those emotions, or maybe they have a tendency of taking it out on the parents, right? Those just snide remarks, right? So instead of saying, you know, how dare you speak to me like this, or you should not be talking in such way, right? The first step is really validating their feelings and observing, being observant and say, I notice, it seems like you had a bad day, or it sounds like you don't like what's happening, right? So giving them almost the emotional fluency, right? It sounds like you're upset. It sounds like you felt, left out today on the playground, right? So being specific about what they're feeling and maybe calling out whether you observe it, the trigger of what they're causing what they're feeling, right? Will help them develop emotional intelligence. Or if you don't know what's happening, ask questions. So instead of making statements, you can also ask, what's bothering you? And I cannot emphasize this more because when I teach emotional intelligence at the college level, we tend to do an exercise where, I would ask my students to come up with 3 questions that you really wished people had asked you, whether it's your family
Oh.
members, your friends. You wish they had asked you, but you never got it. Because often we say, "How are you? What's up?" "Hi, sweetheart. What's going on?" Right? "How was school?" Right? Um, the surface level, But truly, one of the questions that my students every year come up with is, how are you feeling? Right? How are you truly feeling?
Right.
What's causing you to feel this way? And they never get asked that because we as parents tend to make assumptions, right? We're like, they have their limited world of activities, of viewpoints. I'm going to assume that you're upset because of this, something else, right? Not realizing maybe it's something altogether different, however minimized they can be, right? But it's not about minimizing or dismissing. It's really about validating and, asking them what is
Yeah.
happening.
And I think everything you said, I think are so valid points, and I'm so happy that you're saying it both to me and to listeners here. And I think it's something that I talk about both in the office and as a parental coach as well. Of when we have those situations, and I've had it in my office and I've had it in my house when it comes to someone being really flippant and disrespectful in a different situation. And we talk about it, let's say from the world of internal family systems, IFS therapy. We'll talk about it in the sense of what part is that that's screaming right now or just cursed me out? Like, where is that coming from? And like, why are you feeling that? And I think one of the ways to get to the place we could even ask that question is the words that I like using with letters is, we have to ABC the moment. We have to always be curious, like, where's that coming from and what's happening? And if we're able to go out and ask that question internally, then we don't look at it as, how dare you? You can't say that to me. I'm your mother. I'm your father. I'm your therapist. You can't say that. I think it's important to be able to have like, oh, I wonder where that's coming from. And for the most part, I would say over 99%, but I don't know if there are numbers out there when I talk about it. When those type of comments are made, they're not meant to attack you personally. And I think it's really important for us to sort of realize that. And I think that's something you've advocated for. It's something you're talking about. And when we're talking about learning and wanting to be the best parents, I think one of the ways or one of the places we can learn that from is from the concept of leadership, which is I know it's something that you're a big fan of, it's something that you talk about a lot. And I'm curious, coming from that world of being a executive leader and talking about that a lot, are there certain things specifically from the leadership world that you've seen that can really be of benefit when it comes to us parents and being the best version of ourselves in general?
Yeah. One of the biggest thing I emphasize, and I speak a lot about this, whether it's at Google or, financial services, is the element of respect. Um, People want to be respected. That's the number one thing. And there are so much trends in the corporate world where saying that, X amount, a high percentage of employees and workers are feeling disrespected at work. And you can imagine, if these are parents, they take the sense of hurt, sense of, negativity and disrespect and stress there. How might they react at home? Right. And so it translates in the sense that, again, it goes to the power dynamics that we need to help our kids to feel respected. And of course, vice versa, that needs to be reciprocated. Right. And so we mentioned earlier that they may have these tantrums and they may say things that to almost hurt you in the moment. It may feel like it's on purpose and maybe it is on purpose, right? But we need to have to cultivate this safe space so that in some ways they can try on these outfits of persona of words and help them understand the implications and how that feels, right? Uh, Maybe it's not an outfit that you want to ever wear, but you have to try it on to know that. And so to have that space for them where they can experiment will enable our kids to come back to us over and over again, especially when they're faced with incredibly vulnerable and embarrassing things that it's really hard to share with anybody else, right? Um, and so the respect in the workplace and leadership is really respect the people around you, the people you manage. And that is the opposite of creating that toxic workspace, right? We also have toxic home space, right? When there is a lack of respect. And modeling respect is also about how you respect other people in front of the kids, how you talk to anybody from the walks of life. And that also is tied into helping our kids understand and express empathy for themselves, for each other, for ourselves.
Yeah, I think there's so many great points over there that that we can sort of go into more. But I always want to be mindful of the time, and also there's so many different things when it comes to leadership that we can bring into parenting, like you're saying. And I think teaching empathy and practicing it ourselves is so important. And I think one area we haven't talked about for something that I know you're a big advocate about, and you've even come up with your own way of doing it. Was when we come to games and like playing games and stuff. And I'm curious if you could talk about that a little bit of a what it is that you created specifically, and what is it about games in general that can really be of benefit when it comes to enhancing our emotional intelligence.
Yeah. So games are spontaneous, right? They're fun. They're non-threatening because a lot of the times, when we tell our kids to let's sit down, face to face, let's have a talk. It already there's a connotative sort of sense of obligation or oh my gosh, what's going to happen, and or in the case of teens, not again, mom and dad, right? Or I don't have time for this, or it basically is sometimes a recipe for rebellion. And so when you engage in games, it's whimsical, right? And you're really, so I created these card games that are sort of anchored on the four competencies of emotional intelligence to help kids and adults to co regulate and build self awareness, self management, how to regulate emotions, social awareness, and relationship skills together by having conversations, whether it's about a situation that has happened for you parents, right, in the past, or the kids, but in a very, non-judgmental, curious, and open way. And players of the game have the ability to skip cards or situations or conversations they're not comfortable with, but inevitably what I've found is that it sort of always all comes back, and it's amazing where if you just let your child speak and reflect, sort of making their thinking visible, and as parents too, the magical moments, right? You're like, "Oh my gosh," those moments, like, where your kids start to say these things, you're like, "I'm just gonna shut up and listen because this is incredible," right? They are the adults at this moment, right? So it's those moments where you allow yourself to see that and allow your child to exercise that and to witness it within themselves, right? Being, proactively mindful and visibly verbally mindful is truly incredible. And so that's
That's
why we
amazing.
gamify conversations and building and practicing skills through scenarios.
That's awesome. Where can people find this game?
Sure, they can find it on Amazon, Walmart, my website, which is mindbrainemotion.com. It also includes a lot of free resources, and each card deck comes with online learning. And so we have social scripts and actions and videos and all those great stuff.
Amazing, and we'll obviously post the show notes, a link in our show notes to talk more about this because I think there's when it comes to play, there's so many things, and it brings a certain camaraderie when it comes to how to have relationships and how to work on things, and obviously awareness as well, and that spontaneity I think is also really really important, and I think it's something that we all need to work on more. As much as we think we might be good at it, I think when it comes to parenting and when it comes to emotional intelligence, there's a lot more that we can constantly learn and grow with. Are there certain things, because I really, there's probably dozen more things that we can talk about that we haven't even touched yet. But I'm curious in our short conversation that we've had, are there certain things regarding emotional intelligence that we haven't talked about that you feel is important just to at least mention to people?
Yeah. I think it's important to know that it's an ongoing process. And sometimes we beat ourselves up when we make a screaming match or mistake or yelling, knowing that it's okay. Like just be mindful that instead of blaming yourself, learn from it and know that it's a process. And instead of trying to, you know, sort of read that textbook about emotional intelligence, ways of practice are all around you. It's really about taking notice and getting curious.
Getting curious. That's exactly it. But on the topic of things to read and stuff, just ending here on some rapid fire questions. Is there either a book or a podcast or a website that you would recommend that's not your own that people can get more information from when it comes to emotional intelligence?
Yeah, well, we've been talking about the car situation, very much in the teenager zone, and so I love Dr. Lisa Damore. She's written, a number of books about teenagers, emotional lives of teenagers. She focused first more on girls, but now both. And so she's also got a great podcast. I think it's Ask Dr. Lisa, something around that. Yeah.
Okay, we'll look it up and we'll post that in the show notes over here. If you can think of one person in history that you would like to have had or have lunch with, who would that be?
Oh, wow. So many. Oh my goodness. Someone I could have lunch with.
Yep,
It is so dead or alive?
dead or alive.
Oh, okay. So I was a Montessori school director, and so I'm a huge fan of the
Nice.
pedagogy around Montessori, sort of, really how you can enable kids, and so Maria Montessori, um
Yeah,
although we would need some translation involved, but I'd be really
that's true.
curious in sort of
Yeah.
the origin of it and, through her eyes and how she actually would see the world today.
Oh, that sounds like some awesome conversation I'd love to hear about. I should have picked it up that that's somewhere you would go with that, but that's a great answer. I don't think we've ever gotten on the podcast, so kudos to you for picking her. I think that's a really good one. My last question for you, Jenny, would be if you could think of an everyday mundane superpower that you would like to have as a mom, what would that be?
So, as a mom, um, you know okay, so mundane, well, okay, so I would say the ability to summon objects and people. Summoning my kids. But also, honestly, the everyday summoning of ingredients, of groceries, of laundry, right? How efficient and productive would that be?
Oh my God, it would save hours. Dr. Jenny, this has been absolutely amazing. And I really thank you so much. And I hope everyone was able to learn and grow as much as I have.
Thank you so much for having me.